Thank you, everyone. This is going to be an interesting discussion with three esteemed writers about what's happened in the past, how we kind of try and make sense of it ourselves. But first, I want to thank the festival for making me read 3 books very, very quickly. I had no plans to read any books this year. It was all about YouTube. So thank you to the festival. I want to introduce the writers very quickly. Amitav Ghosh needs no introduction. He's been writing marvelous works, classic works, about history, geography, things all the way to climate over the last 30 years. I've read a few. Wonderful. The one that I want to touch on today's discussion is Smoke and Ashes, the one about the opium trade. But he's a master at this storytelling and the works of fiction, which are amazing. Sathnam, from my old home country, the UK, has written 2 marvelous books. One I've read, Empire Land, which will be, again, subject to some of the questions I'm going to ask him today. So he's brought in this idea of biography as he's growing up and making sense of empire. I kind of really click with that, so I've got some questions for him, but we're really going to enjoy the session, what we're going to talk about. And lastly, my colleague Isna, I've known for over 10 years in Indonesia. We're in the same old trade, which is sustainability. Sustainability being the one that we actually try to do less damage and make the world a better place. I know it's a bit old-fashioned. And the remarkable thing about Isna is we both have the same publisher, that she's been working in poetry, translating important works into Indonesian. She's written a marvelous novel, which we're going to touch on today, Mountains More Ancient, which looks at the connection between Indonesia and South Africa, the whole trafficking situation, through a novel. And incidentally, in the background, she's writing a work about her father, who was a revolutionary involved in the revolution, negotiated independence for Indonesia. He was in the room. That's another thing that's in the works. So thank you very much. Thank you. It's always good to size up the audience. I want a show of hands. Be honest. All the optimists in the room, show of hands, please.
Good.
I'd say that's about 70%. Fair? So all the historians, you don't need to raise your hands. It's fine. We've got you. We've balanced this out. Thank you. Shall we get started? Okay. I want to start with Sathnam. Growing up in the UK, we've had this kind of odd kind of experience of observing the empire, how it shaped our lives, our parents. There's one thing that my dad told me when I was growing up. It didn't really make much sense, but it stuck with me, which was, by the time the Brits left India, we couldn't make a needle. As I kind of read a bit more books, I read Amitav's works, Isna's works, your works. I kind of get the sense this is about deindustrializing a country. Empire was more than just taking money out of places. It was changing the world in really significant ways. Is there something that your parents told you when you were growing up, or your uncles, your grandparents, about their experience of the empire, how they understood the British in India, that kind of resonates with you?
I wish, but no. Basically, there's so many novels and memoirs I read written by white British authors where they go up into an attic and they discover a load of letters, beautifully written letters, which talk about politics and colonialism. And my dad can't read or write, so my mum couldn't speak English. So there were no letters, and no one ever talked about politics. There were no books in the house. There were no newspapers. I only remember my granddad saying vaguely, "Oh, those white guys are really clever." And that was the extent of our conversation with my grandfather. But despite that, what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years has been a complete change in the way colonialism is talked about, partly through people like Amitav who were there at the beginning, but, I'm joining the party later. But for many, many decades, the only view of British Empire was the view of the white man, the view of the colonizer. That's what all the documentaries banged on about. You very rarely heard the view of the colonized or the enslaved. But now you are getting that viewpoint, and it drives a lot of people insane because it's a complete revision of the way we see history. But that's what history is. History is argument. And our understanding of the Stone Age is changing, understanding of the Roman Empire is changing, and our understanding of colonialism is definitely changing very radically.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anyone want to add to that before we go to the next question?
Go ahead.
Okay. Sure. Amitav, this is for you. it touches on another thing I picked out of Empireland, which was rather than this thing about decolonizing the curriculum in schools, it was widening it, including all the other stuff that you've talked about in your book, which I thought was a really elegant way of, trying to change the view of how kids are educated. From the Indian perspective, as you're the expert in that area, what are kids taught about this thing that happened with the British in India over the centuries? Is there much there? And I'm going to ask you a double question. Have the heroes and the villains changed much? Have you observed that it's still the same villains, still the same heroes when it comes to the colonial period?
Well, I have to say that reading Sathnam's work, I'm very struck by how his work responds to a certain culture war that's actually ongoing within the Anglosphere, throughout the Anglosphere. But I grew up in India. I was educated in India, and on the whole, we were brought up with a kind of nationalist perspective. So we sort of knew that that the imperialists were bad and so on. That they did all sorts of bad things. But actually, the discovery of how bad they were really came as a surprise to me. Because I knew nothing about the colonial opium trade, even though I'd studied history and so on. But I really knew almost nothing about it. It was only when I started writing my novel, Sea of Poppies, that I got into it. Because, suddenly out of the background, they emerged this whole tapestry. And, essentially the British Empire was an imperial narco-state, as was the Dutch Empire. The Dutch actually pioneered the imperial narco-state. But we were never taught any of that, And that's not because of a lack of sources or a lack of information. If you go to the British Library, to the India Office Library, the amount of material that exists on the opium trade, is absolutely staggering, which is one of the reasons why it's hard to write about it. There's just too much material. But, it's in discovering those things that you really discover, what a lasting effect this empire has had. And also, really, how malign it was, really, there's no other way to put it.
Do you say it was evil?
Gandhi called it satanic. He called the British Empire satanic, and I think he was actually right. Certainly, what they were up to with their whole opium business, there's no other way to describe it.
Yeah. Thank you. Isna, this is a nice segue when we're talking about drugs. Your book, your novel, it's a really important novel. I believe that this novel is going to kickstart a new genre of the Indonesian archipelago in Africa. That whole Asia-Africa connection is going to be happening with what you've done, what you've started. But I think you told me a story from the Indonesian perspective about your father and the little bit of opium that they had.
Okay.
Tell us about that. That's a fascinating story.
So in 1947, he was sent by the New Republic, 1947. We declared independence. For those of you who are not familiar with Indonesian history, Indonesia declared independence in 1945, 17th of August, just a week after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in 1947, the new government, recognizing that the Dutch would be trying to reclaim the colony, Sultan Syahrir, then the prime minister, sent a few young Indonesians to New York to the United Nations Security Council to get attention. So to bring it to an international discussion rather than a bilateral negotiation or a war. He had to fly from Yogyakarta through Bukit Tinggi, which is in West Sumatra. And in Bukit Tinggi, he picked up a few other passengers, among them one of his good friends from school, carrying 2 bags of opium to bring to Singapore, to smuggle into Singapore, let's more precisely. And to basically fund the revolution. And in his interview with the National Archives, he wrote, I was so nervous getting on that plane with my good friend with two suitcases of opium, because it would be a disaster if we were caught, and the newspapers would say Indonesian delegation to the UN caught carrying opium, and that would be a failure of the revolution. So anyway, but they managed to get into Singapore. He went on to Manila and then managed to get to New York. But this opium is actually part of the items confiscated or passed on from the Japanese warehouses. So the Republic actually inherited that opium from the Japanese occupiers.
Interesting. Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Before we change the tone a bit. In terms of what kids are taught in school about the revolution, what you've looked at in your mountains, most ancient, and what you're working on now, do you think there's new things you can add to that curriculum, what you're taught about, Merdeka?
Yeah, so I think history books, I was not a good student of history when I was in school. I really didn't like the subject because we had to memorize dates and different names of kings and who conquered who. It wasn't interesting to me at that time. But I realized that, it was a part of nation building. I grew up in the 70s where Suharto, the New Order, and it was like a one narrative that we all had to build the country, and we fought and we won. So it was a very simplified version. It probably cut just sort of very thin layer of what history was. But now as I'm looking more into depth, for example, on the mountains more ancient, the fact that we had people enslaved or taken into a slave trade from Indonesia to South Africa is completely unknown. I have readers, Indonesian and foreigners, who read my book and say, we had no idea about it. That was the reaction I got when I first discovered this in Cape Town. So I think there's now an unearthing. There's a new generation of historians who are looking into or trying to dig into more aspects of history with more different kinds of medium. Not just academic books. So I think maybe in 10 to 20 years we'll see more dynamic narratives on Indonesia.
Thank you. I'll come back to Sathnam. You've done a lot of unearthing of material in your book Empire Land, and it seems like you've got some of a thumbs up and a thumbs down from different quarters. What's that like when people say this is not right, what you're talking about, when you make these, would you call it, discoveries of your work, about empire, this kind of deep roots?
Well, it's deeply contradictory because it's really positive. I'd say it's been 95% positive, and it's a very surreal thing. I'm not an historian, and suddenly my book's been taught in schools, and it's in some 16,000 copies across British schools.
Well done.
Lots of teachers have embraced it. I get letters all the time from students saying they're studying history because they're inspired by the book, but at the same time, I also get death threats and
That's 5%, right?
Yeah, but you tend to remember the death threats, right? Yeah. And the abuse and the people shouting at you at events like this. So yeah, it's something psychological about that. I think I've learned to. I've been doing this for about 5 years now. When I started, I used social media quite a lot to make my points, but I feel like there's been an organized response against historians, imperial historians. There's certain talking points that the right make, which are so stupid that I've now stopped engaging. Because of all the thousands of engagements I've had on social media, I don't think I've not once changed anyone's mind. Or no one's ever said, oh, right, I've read the evidence, I've now altered my opinion. And I realized that about a year ago, and it's pointless, it's all pointless.
So that's why we go for the kids.
Go for the kids, and actually go for readers. Yeah. And I work for a right-wing newspaper who don't necessarily agree with what I say, but some of my readers do, and I get letters from people in their 70s saying, oh, I was taught this at school, but I now realize it was propaganda and I've changed my mind. I just hope that I can get to the age of 70 and change my mind. I think that is just a really good ambition to have in life.
That's what scientists do for a living, right? That's what they should do.
That's what science is. That's what peer review is. What history is. You get someone like Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, saying, he stood up in the House of Commons recently and said, in relation to slavery, he said, historians should stop unpicking history. And it's a bit like saying builders should stop building, because it's what historians do.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to him in a minute, towards the end of the talk. He is a favourite of mine. In fact, I can't tell the difference which one's which. They all seem the same. But we'll come back to that. Amitav, in your marvellous book, it really is a killer. Smoke and Ashes. You dig up some stuff about America where you now live, particularly the Boston Brahmins. Can you just give the audience a flavour of the Boston Brahmins? And when you did put that into print, meticulously researched all that dirty money and where it ended up, did you get any bad vibes on any saying this is no good, etc., like this poor guy's had to suffer?
I know. I mean, reading and listening to your descriptions of the culture wars that have erupted around you, I keep thinking, oh my God, I would never be able to deal with that. But no, see, the stuff about the Boston Brahmins is really very well known. I mean, there have been several American historians who've written about it. So the story is that really, after America attained its independence in 1783, they really had nobody to trade with because they were surrounded by these British colonies, which wouldn't trade with them. So they had to find someone to trade with, and that someone became China. So what happened with them was a reprise of the whole British history of trading with China, which is that they desperately needed Chinese goods, most of all tea. Tea was a very major revenue earner for Britain. But they had nothing to sell the Chinese, so they had to buy this with silver. So eventually, they ended up, the British actually quite self-consciously on a certain day in Calcutta decided, okay, now we're going to get them addicted to opium. Because, that opium had no market in China before that, and such a market as it had was for medicinal opium. But then the British started sending, large amounts of opium to China. But even before that, they actually learned from the Dutch practices in the Dutch East Indies. The strange thing about addictive substances is that they don't follow the laws of supply and demand. They create their own demand. Supply creates demand, as we saw with the American opioid crisis. So that's really how it went, they created this whole market for opium and started marketing opium on a large scale.
Thank you. To make opium in vast quantities, you need collaboration, you need cooperation, you need partnerships in Indonesia, in Africa, in South America, maybe less so South America, but definitely in India. I want to explore a little bit just the idea of the concept, the reality of collaboration. I'll start with you, Isna. In Indonesia, they took a lot out. And how was that possible? There's not many Dutch people in Indonesia at the time.
Yeah, but of course they collaborated with rulers that they could coerce into either giving them a monopoly or exchanging with favors. I mean, even also this issue about connection between Indonesia and South Africa. Princes, warriors, spiritual leaders were exiled to South Africa, and in some cases they were receiving allowances from the VOC, but the VOC would get reimbursed from one of the sultans that are under their control here in Java, for example. So that collaboration was there, but I think I don't know enough about the history of the collaboration, because there was always this, in one court, royal court, there'd be this uncle and this son against, and the main king and maybe another son who are for the POC. So it was very much a royal court interplay that really what you call confused the power structures in old Nusantara.
I always like to compare things, and I always like to compare in my head. Don't laugh. India and China, India and Indonesia. Indonesia had a proper revolution. People got killed. In India, we didn't really have much of a revolution. We just killed each other. But in terms of once the dust had settled, in terms of this elite classes collaborating and enabling this commodity economy to run for smoothly for so long, was there any impact, consequence in these collaborators, or were they just forgotten about and just got back to business?
Well, I think there was a period also when many of the rulers also became republic supporters. So that was sort of a natural amnesty. So probably the Japanese occupation gave that sort of distance a little bit of a time for things to recalibrate.
Right.
Yeah.
I was reading in the news, Amitav, just a couple of weeks ago, I read the obituary of Ratan Tata, the huge industrialist, one of the big billionaires in the world in terms of what they do, what they produce. I was looking just at the obituary because I'd read what you told me in the book about, these trading families, and one of them were the Tatas. I couldn't find anything in there about their origin story. It was just wasn't there. Do you find that odd or normal?
The reality is that the opium trade was the main commerce of the British Empire, and certainly if you were from a commercial caste or from any commercial community in 19th century India, you really had no option but to trade in opium. So every single major Indian commercial community had their hands very deep in opium, whether it was Hindus or Muslims or whoever. So they were all trading opium. The Parsis became the face of it because unlike the other Indian commercial communities, they actually made the journey to China. And this was why they became great innovators, because it was the same with the Americans. So starting from the early 1800s, lots of young Americans, especially these Boston Brahmins, made these enormous fortunes in China. But actually, much more than the capital, they also learned how to trade with the world. They learned about all the new developments that were happening. They learned about railroads. They learned about hoteliering and so on. So these were intangible assets that they brought back with them to their various home countries. So the early American traders, for example, these were guys who went to China at the age of like 16 and made these enormous fortunes and then came back to America by the time they were like 20, 25, something like that. And then they poured their money into the early American economy. So, for example, American railroads were financed really by money from China, by these drug barons, but also by their Chinese counterparts. So so I really don't think that one can really point a finger as such at Ratan Tata because he's several generations removed from that, And in any case, the Tatas arose in the late 19th century when really the opium trade was declining in importance, if you like, in comparison with other forms of industry and commerce and so on. So Jamshedji Tata actually made a fair amount of money in opium, but his main money actually came from provisioning British Army stuff. So actually the other road to success in the British Empire was being a mercenary soldier, as you know all too well, because Sikhs were really must.
I wasn't a mercenary soldier, but my people were.
Talking about extraction, you've looked at this quite a lot in Empire Land and where money comes from and then how people forget about where it ends up. And it's almost like a whitewashing of history. What are the kind of salient points you've got for that.
Yeah, I guess there's the big conversation in Britain is about how slavery financed various aspects of British life. And there are some people who really don't accept it at all. But the fact is, when Britain ended slavery, it paid 40% of the national budget that year to the slave owners. That is an indication of how important slavery was. The government wouldn't have paid out that much money if it wasn't a hugely significant industry. But now you could trace the legacies in so many different aspects of British life. I mean, companies like Green King, the brewer, they own slaves, the founders of Green King. Lloyd's of London, heavily involved in slavery. Yeah. The Bank of England, the royal family, the biggest institution involved in the British transatlantic slave trade was the Royal African Company, which made money for the royal family. It was chaired in royal palaces. The slaves who arrived in Barbados had the initials of the Duke of York branded into their skin, you know, and I don't think the royal family were aware of this until last year, when historians pointed this out during the coronation, when people came to represent Barbados and mentioned it, you know, in the days up to the coronation. And the response of the royal family was, oh, we'll commission some research. And they didn't commission research. All they did was they said, we approve of the research being done already. The research being done was one PhD student who is actually not even British. She's from the Netherlands. And it's embarrassing because the Dutch royal family have commissioned proper research. They've got a whole committee of historians looking into the slave involvement of the Dutch royal family in slavery. And they're going to find out things about the royal family. And actually, the British royal family, because William of Orange was both a British monarch and a Dutch monarch. So the Dutch are going to find out stuff about our history before we do. But there's huge levels of denial about how much slavery financed possibly the Industrial Revolution itself.
If I might add to that,
please.
The Dutch royal family profited hugely from the opium regime, you know, which was their opium monopoly in the Dutch East Indies. So King William, not only did he have slave money, he had enormous amounts of opium money.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, or the current Prime Minister of the UK. In the last year, we've had a brown Tory Prime Minister in the UK. Right now, the UK has a black Foreign Minister. But at the same moment, what the UK has been doing for the last year is providing logistics, naval, airport bases, flights, reconnaissance, intelligence, weapons to carry out crimes against humanity, genocide. It just goes on, mass starvation, mass amputation. It went last year from a brown Tory MP, Prime Minister, Conservative, to a Labour Prime Minister. But the thing hasn't changed. What I'm trying to understand is, and I'll come to you on this in a kind of roundabout way, about countries growing up. Does it really matter? Does diversity really matter that much when we're just going to behave like immoral, inhuman war criminals, etc., etc.? Does diversity really matter in the UK? Have we peaked, or should we keep going, or have we got diminishing returns if we keep pushing the diversity box?
I think you have got to, despite whatever your politics are, you've got to embrace the fact that there are so many people of colour in politics. They might be idiots, they might be hypocrites, they might be awful, they might not even be doing what they believe in, but you've got to, it's progress of sorts, right? But
so it's like diverse genocide.
No, but it's like the problem is with someone like David Lammy, Foreign Secretary. I mean, I've done radio programs with him. Is he's doing the exact opposite of what he believes? You know, he believes in reparations, and now he's basically saying we're not going to even talk to these Commonwealth countries about reparations. He has very strong views about Palestine, which he's very much not fulfilling. That is a bigger problem. It's hypocrisy. But I think we've got to get away from the idea that just because you're black or brown, you're going to have certain views. And it's an international phenomenon. It's definitely true in America that the old loyalty between ethnicities and certain parties is totally breaking down. I mean, look at the number of black men who are going to vote for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, a man who, I mean, his cabinet is not exactly diverse, right? Whose father was a member of the KKK, I think.
Would it make any difference if the whole cabinet was diverse in Trump's cabinet? The genocide would continue, right?
Yeah, I mean, Israel is so complicated, but
If it wasn't Israel, it'd be somewhere else, right?
yeah, I mean, I don't know what we do there. I mean, but also, this is not the first time it happened. Look at Iraq. But I think we also, there's an amnesia. Like the situation in Iraq was arguably created by the British 100 years beforehand when we installed a disastrous Hashemite monarchy and thereby created the conditions for revolution for Saddam Hussein to rise. But I don't ever remember anyone commenting on that. There's a disconnect in Britain between the stuff we do and the stuff we did in the past. We just don't think about it. And the Opium Wars that you've written about so well in your trilogy, I would say 1%, half of 1% of British people know anything about the Opium Wars. Even that might be high.
That used to include me until I read the book.
Yeah, would you agree, Amitav? What you saying?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask the ordinary English or American person what were the Opium Wars, the likely answer you're going to get is that China was making war on the West to force to take opium, whereas exactly the opposite is the case. You know, it's bizarre. I mean, it's really bizarre how people have just completely swallowed these myths of empire.
I'm kind of coming around to moaning about the UK to looking at Indonesia. In my perspective, my view, maybe I'm wrong, it seems like when the Dutch gave it up, all the loot, they kind of became more of a normal country, whereas I can see the UK has never become a normal country. It still does all the things that it used to do in different ways, and it doesn't get much of a return, but it keeps doing it. Has Holland changed fundamentally? Has it become more normal? I don't see the UK being normal. Maybe it's something about the collective amnesia and not going to see a therapist or whatever, but have the Dutch kind of become normal country, a normal medium-sized European economy that doesn't go around doing all the stuff that the UK still managed to pull off through the City of London?
I don't know enough about Dutch politics or history, but I know that in the Second World War, although they were part of the Allies, they were a junior partner of the Allies. They were actually dependent on the U.S. for reconstruction after the war. The relationship with Indonesia can be said to be positive, right? But it was only last year, I think, they acknowledged that our independence officially is 17th of August 1945, although they say that it's not supposed to have any legal repercussions because we had to pay the Dutch government in 49, or we had to commit to repaying their debt, 4.8 billion guilders. So, 70 some years later, they acknowledged 1945 because in 49 they had already accepted a commitment to 10 minutes left.
Yep.
Sorry.
If we've got 10 minutes, I suppose I should open up to the optimists. Please, any questions for the distinguished writers? Short questions, please. Please.
I just like this practice a
You might need to wait for the microphone.
chat.
No, it's
Is there a microphone coming?
I think there's
It normally is.
that one here.
Give her yours.
Yeah, you can't mind.
Here's another one.
Thank you. The question was for you anyway. What you said about your parents not having literature in the house, not having newspapers, it kind of resonates with me. Oh, sorry. Sathnam, what you said about, parents, first generation, South Asians, and not having literature in the house, not reading books, not being encouraged to do it. When I was reading books, my mother would say to me, "What's she doing? Why are you reading these silly storybooks? Read a textbook." Typical South Asian first generation. So my question is, what inspired you to get into literature when it was kind of against you growing up, or you weren't inspired by it within the house?
Oh yeah, no, it's bizarre because my dad totally illiterate and my mom only had a couple of years of schooling, and yeah, my dad also has schizophrenia, and one of his hallucinations he has is he thought the TV was talking to him, and he would go to the library and pick up a newspaper, and he thought, even though he couldn't read, he thought the stories were about him. And now I'm in a situation where I am actually writing in the newspaper, and he sees my face. So it's like a fulfillment of his psychosis that I'm doing this. It's quite bizarre that I've ended up doing this. I think there's something about if you're from a very working class culture in Britain, everyone in my family was working in factories or unemployed. No one had gone to university. I was working in a factory at the age of 9 for 50p an hour. You're not just a working class, you're the underclass. You don't exist. And I think what I discovered in writing from a very early age when I started writing for my local newspaper is that I existed. And for me, it makes me feel alive. And although I moan about it, like all writers moan about writing because it's hard and lonely and sometimes badly paid and sometimes people come and screaming you, but it makes me feel like I exist, and I think I would wither away if I didn't have writing. So best of luck with your work.
Any other questions? Short questions, please.
Stuff. So many microphones now.
Hi, I'm intrigued. In the age of Google, some of you have stumbled on some real gems that must have given you an absolute buzz. Oh gosh, I can incorporate that in my next book. I know there's not time, but perhaps one of you could give an answer about some little tidbit that really changed your perspective and was an absolute gem to stumble on that you could worm into your work.
Amitav, please.
Well, like everyone, I use Google a lot, but I can't remember any particular instance.
I don't mean on Google, I mean in a library somewhere, in the bowels of a building somewhere, somewhere unexpected.
You mean a quote?
Just some facts, like about the opium trade or something that you...
Give some sensational facts about the empire.
Okay, I think that's on.
The British Empire is the same surface area as the size of the moon. There's a fact for you.
I think Isna wants to say something.
I think I stumbled upon the story of the Cape Malay people who are descendants, a mixture of different peoples, but including from Indonesia. I stumbled upon that in outside of Cape Town in the Franschhoek area, in the wine estate area, in a museum of a wine estate with the names and ages, the origins of the slaves that worked on that particular winery. And that's what started the whole process of me researching into the Cape Malay.
I've got another fact. The Irish population of Ireland has only just recovered from the results of the Great Potato Famine caused by the British, because so many people died and so many people emigrated. It's only hundreds of years later that the Irish population has recovered. Dark fact.
Well,
Do we have time for one more, or are we going to get shut down?
We have 20 minutes.
5 minutes regrets.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Why?
Okay, so keep talking. Okay.
Okay. I think Amitav wanted to say something.
Please.
well, just the question, what you were saying reminded me, I was working in the archives in Mauritius, and I found a letter written in the late 18th century by a plantation owner who was writing to the Governor General of Tamil Nadu in India, what is now Tamil Nadu, southern India, and he was asking him for slaves to work on his plantation, and the plantation owner's name was Leclésio, and as you know, a French writer called Leclésio won the Nobel Prize some years ago, and he's from Mauritius. So you do find these strange sorts of...
I've just thought another one. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, was at one point going to become a slave.
That broke
Driver.
my heart when I read that.
Yeah, he was just about to leave.
He was my hero.
And then he came into money or he got a job or something and didn't go. But this is the weird position of Scotland. Scotland likes to see itself as colonized. But actually, the Scots were disproportionately involved in the British Empire's bastards, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought he was a fine socialist when I read that and my heart's broken. Robert Burns. Let's continue. I think we've got a bit more time and we'll come back to any juicy questions from the audience. I want to get to making the world a better place. Humble historians, authors, writers that you are. There's a bit of a thing going on right now with the Caribbean states asking for a certain amount of cash and reparations from the UK. Commonwealth countries are joining in on that kind of request for give us something back for all the damage you've done. I'll just start with an Isna, just from the Indonesian perspective. Is there much of a movement for that reparations, or have you got what you get?
I don't hear that here, even among the population or the general public or the government. I think the experience of having to pay back the Dutch, I think, has put us in a very low, that issue in a very low bar.
Do you think that getting artifacts, treasures looted from museums back is like a bonus? Or do you think that was necessary?
That is probably necessary. But also, I think the approach they took was that, the Indonesian government took, was that don't just dump it to us. We'll go there and we'll send a team of curators, select the type items that we want to bring them in stages. So we took control of the process.
By the way, you've got lots of questions back there.
Oh, good. Okay, we'll come back to them. I'm not finished with my people on stage.
You don't get to dodge the question.
Has India given up on this reparations claim, or is it something that's more peculiar to the Caribbean states, let's say, right now?
I don't think India has ever talked about reparations. In fact, Gandhi very famously said, we don't want reparations. What we want is no repetition of what happened in the past. So that was his position.
It's a big news story yesterday in the British press, because Keir Starmer has said he's not going to even talk to the Commonwealth countries about reparations. I think the word reparations is part of the problem, because it implies that it can be repaired. How do you repair 3 million enslaved people losing their lives? You're never going to make up for that. And also, it puts people's backs up because, the money, I've heard sums like $777 trillion the West owes for slavery. And in Britain, I don't know if you know, we have terrible railways. The Wi-Fi doesn't work in Scotland. How are we ever going to pay 777? It's not going to happen. But I think we need to look at what China's doing and Russia. They're investing in Africa and Sri Lanka and so on. Maybe that's the way we should see it. We should see it as investment in these countries where we've had dodgy histories. And actually, I think we have begun the process. We just don't realize it. So I would argue that the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, which has brought peace to Ireland, has been a process of reparations and post-colonial truth and reconciliation, because money was invested. Apologies were made. There's an apology for the potato famine. I think there's an apology for Bloody Sunday. Similarly, in Kenya, we were sued by the victims of the Mau Mau case. We didn't do it willingly, but we paid £20 million in compensation. There was an official apology from William Hague, the Foreign Secretary. And as a result, our relationship with Kenya is better. We just need to do that for 69 more countries, and then we'll be fine.
But that's a bargain, isn't it? 20 million a pop? That's
pretty good, yeah. But it's a start. Cheap. For a country that doesn't even apologise, yes.
And you guys aren't even Scottish. That's really cheap.
Yeah. I always find it weird because English people will apologise for anything. An English person will, you'll tread on their feet and they'll say sorry, but they will not apologise for massacres and genocides. It's very odd.
Yeah. Let's go back to, is there anything else the audience, the writers want to say, or open back to the audience anymore? Gentlemen here.
Yeah, it is often said that those who do not understand or remember history are destined to relive it. As historians, is that still relevant? And how can we make it have more meaning and really carry much further in the world as we move forward?
Kate.
I'm not an historian, so I can't answer that.
They're not historians, they're optimists.
Oh,
Can you make an easier question?
Amitav, you're going to have to answer this.
Well, the quote I prefer is history never repeats itself, but it does rhyme, which is what Mark Twain said. So I think, yeah, there's an eternal return. So it does happen in a cyclical way.
what can we do to make that? What can we do to make that more relevant as we move forward? Because we keep repeating the same errors, it seems.
Look, I mean, if we look around the world right now, it's perfectly plain that we are hurtling towards catastrophe. And far from trying to prevent this catastrophe, we are accelerating towards it. And the world has never been closer to nuclear war than it is now, not even during the Cold War. And the most unsettling part of it is that people seem to have forgotten the fear of nuclear weapons. So when I look around the world right now, it just seems to me that we're in a state of utter derangement. You know, there's nothing else to be said.
I think it's solipsism. I think people don't read, and they feel like they want to experience it for themselves. It feels like the world is in the mood for dictatorship. I mean, people in America really want Donald Trump dictator, because they might have heard about dictatorships at school, but they don't read about the history. People don't read. That's the problem. If everyone in the world read, there would be more understanding, but also there would be empathy. I think what reading gives you, to go back to the question you asked, is you put yourself in someone else's shoes. And it really shows that Donald Trump doesn't read, because he's completely incapable of empathy. And it's really clear that Kamala Harris does read, and I do think books are the answer. I know you're not a fan of Kamala, but...
I'm not a fan of either. I'm
Yeah.
agnostic, remember?
But look, she's read a couple more books than Donald Trump. Would you accept that?
They were ghost-written, probably. Another question, please?
But
In the back there.
In front.
I've got one at the front then.
doesn't make five.
Oh, some people at the back. Okay, you're next.
Okay. Thank you. This question probably for Amitav. I'm a big fan of you. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Amitav, in one of your interview, you mentioned that the climate crisis that we are facing today is a violence against environment and also humans. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it is also deeply rooted from the Western colonizations. And as Indonesian, the way I see our government ruling our country right now, it is also still implementing the legacy of the colonizations, like what happened in Papua, for instance. And I would like to ask, not just in Papua, but actually other parts of Indonesia with the land grabbing and everything. And I would like to ask, how do you see we as a society progress on this? Like, is still, you just briefly mentioned that we are in another stage of derangement. Would you please explain further about that? And how do you see we, progress in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. So your question reminds me of a trip that I made to Ternate, Ternate is the island, or rather the chain of islands, which had the exclusive use of the clove tree. The clove tree was endemic to Ternate, and so for centuries and centuries until the Dutch got there, the people of Ternate became rich, trading in cloves and so on. And I actually met the person who is currently the Sultan of Ternate. And it's very interesting, because of climate change, the clove trees of Ternate are dying. It's a terrible thing to see, because this tree of life for the islanders is vanishing in front of their eyes. So when I met the Sultan, I asked him, as I asked a lot of the farmers in Ternate, that do you think you should shrink your carbon footprint because of, you're also contributing to climate change? And their answer to me uniformly was the same thing that I've heard in China, in India, everywhere else, which is, why should we shrink our carbon footprint? They are not shrinking their carbon footprint over there in the West. They got rich when we were weak and helpless. Now it's our turn. So it's very interesting. I think throughout the global South, climate change is not seen in the same way that it's seen in the global North. In the global North, it's seen as a sort of techno-scientific problem to be fixed with, techno-scientific solutions. In the global South, it's seen as a geopolitical problem.
Right.
And that's what makes it so difficult to resolve this issue, because it's absolutely clear that in the global South, people are waiting to see if the West, the affluent countries, are at all prepared to take any meaningful action. And by now, it's clear that they're not. So, Biden talks a good game about, environmental solutions of various kinds, but at the same time, he virtually bans the import of Chinese cars, Chinese electric vehicles into the United States. That would be a much bigger step for the United States than any other market-based solution. But so, actually, even in the West, it's so clear now that geopolitics trumps any concern for the environment.
Hi, I have the microphone, so I'm going to go ahead and ask a question.
Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay, good. Please.
I wanted to ask a question about, since we're on the debate around colonialism and decolonization, just to talk about how the act of decolonization is being weaponized in certain countries and used to legitimize or promote majoritarianism. Like in India, for instance, where the brutality of the British Empire is being downplayed to discuss the Mughal Empire instead, to promote majoritarianism. And so is this a phenomena that you see in other places? Are we pioneering it? What are your views on it?
No, I've written about this, and I think people in Britain don't understand that Modi is really into decolonization. So, he doesn't speak in English very often. He wants medical degrees to be taught in non-English languages. He's built a brand new parliament for $1.8 billion right next to the British one, even though the British one is fine, but he wants an Indian one. He's knocking down all these statues. But his definition of colonialism includes the Mughal Empire. So it's a way for him to be Islamophobic, basically. But I don't see him at the same time, as far as passionate as he is about decolonization, I don't see him banning cricket. I'd like to see him try to ban cricket.
Or whiskey.
But also, he's not the first to do it. Look at Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and a bunch of African leaders. It's always useful to have a bogeyman. It's always useful to say, let's blame the white man. And I found it very interesting when I went to Nigeria and to talk about colonialism. Almost no one wanted to engage me in conversations about the history. They wanted to talk about their terrible leaders and the corruption, because they've had 60 odd years, right, of independence. And for them, that is more of a live issue. And equally, they've seen other nations make it, relatively speaking. So, yeah, there's definite contradictions and nuance there.
Please.
Just to bring it down to a personal level, what is your process for mentoring, say, the next generation, or do you take on young people and people who are interested in your craft, your publications, and do you work with them on individual levels? I'm just thinking about how we actually pass on the legacy of our knowledge to the next generation and hope that that will somehow be maybe an alternative to the future. What is your thoughts on that and your relationship to, I guess, younger people in your sphere?
Isla, you want to go first?
Well, I've only recently
You've got
become-
fans now, haven't you?
There are some groups that have invited me to speak. A lot of them have younger members. I think some of them are interested in writing, but still in the process also. I'm sort of late in the game in my life, of course. So maybe when I speak to them, I intersperse the writing side and the non-writing side. But I think there is a lot of, among Indonesian young people, there's a lot of interest in writing, I think, as opposed to my generation or just the generation of the Suharto or New Order period. Now the younger generation are feel freer to, and of course with the information access that is more widely open. But I think there are a lot of people now, younger people, who are looking into writing.
Yeah. I mean, I've written a couple of kids' books. I've written a kids' version of my book on empire. So I go to a lot of schools, talk to a lot of students. But I'm going to say something quite controversial here. I think there's too much emphasis on meeting writers, and actually people who want to write have got something in front of the book is what matters. That's the whole point of books, is that people pick them up and read them, and you don't have to be there. And sometimes there's an obsession with almost networking. And I think a lot of people think, if I network with enough writers, I will become a writer. And it's like, I'm sorry, this is not management consultancy. And actually, writing work, as a writer, you have to anti-network. Because if you network all the time, you don't ever get any work done.
Yeah.
You have to, I spend a lot of my time setting up things so that people can't contact me. Because otherwise, you spend all your time speaking to kids who probably want to be a footballer anyway.
Right. We had what? This lady here. Lady in the white.
At the risk
Yeah, look at it.
at the risk of saying there's an elephant in the room, I'm wondering, since the British and my country had so much to do with the current genocide, if you would address what's going on and what we can all do about it. And I'm talking, we used to live in Gaza, so it was the same then, but not from the air. And it's gone on for more than 80 years. Thank you.
You see, I've opened up a can of worms.
I
It's for
spoke
you.
about Israel yesterday, so I'm not going to do it, so you do it. I gave it a 10-minute answer.
Well, the extraordinary thing is that huge majorities, especially across the Anglosphere, and the Anglosphere is basically what is providing these weapons, but huge popular majorities oppose providing these weapons. But it seems to make no difference whatsoever. Kamala Harris, she hasn't made any concessions on this, even though it seems like she's actually going to lose the election because of what's happening in Gaza. Because she's losing Michigan. So what can I say? I mean, there is some bizarre dynamic at work here, which is completely inexplicable.
Do you think it's logical for some people to then say, why don't we not vote, or why don't we vote for a third party, like, say, a Green Party or something?
Yeah,
It's just American.
Muslims and Arabs across America are planning to vote for Jill Stein, yeah.
But Britain had a lot to do with it. I mean,
Yeah, they started it.
yeah, that.
Britain started most things in good and bad ways.
Well, let's not forget the Germans and the Russians and all the other Europeans who really started it. This is a European problem playing out somewhere else. Please.
Baby.
Wow.
My question, it possibly relates a little to this, and you mentioned that we need a boogeyman, and that the empire of white people has been a very convenient and actual boogeyman. I'm not denying that. However, I'm wondering whether while we're fascinated with the colonizing that goes on from state to state, whether we're missing the modern forms of colonization that we need to be actually looking at, and that they are possibly not states, but they are the tech sector, and they are capitalism itself. And is capitalism the next empire that we need to refuse?
That's a wonderful question. Before my distinguished writers answer that, I'm going to be digging into that question tomorrow with Amitav, because I want to go from drugs into capital into this thing that is evolving. But please, to the audience. Sorry.
I would say Amitav's books show that empire was always capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like it's suddenly capitalism is aping empire. It was the same thing. And if you come to William Dalrymple's session on, I think, Sunday morning, ask him about how the East India Company was the first, joint stock company and a model for Amazon and Facebook. And a lot of these companies wouldn't exist in the way they do now. And they wouldn't work with their emphasis on monopolies if the East India Company, the Dutch East India companies, hadn't existed. Sorry?
The Dutch East India Company was actually the first joint stock company.
Yeah. But I think just to add in Amitav's book on the nutmeg, that nutmeg curse, basically the people in the Malu, the Banda Islands, were used to trading with so many people. It was the Europeans who tried to monopolize it. And the local leaders really tried to I'm probably incorrectly paraphrasing, but so it's this monopolizing and trying to get as much returns from that. I mean, we call it greed maybe in a colloquial language, but I think that is part and parcel of the colonial attitude. Yeah.
Yeah. We forget that the British tried to monopolize salt. Famously, right? The salt march of Gandhi, and this is something Indians needed to live by, and it was only Gandhi taking them on. But I would say there's a lot of parallels between what they tried to do there and what Google does, and now is the American State Department the Justice Department is trying to break up Google because it has so much influence over so many of our lives.
Wasn't it Britain the English monarchs who tried to ban companies? I can't remember the name of it. Historians probably know. Way ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I guess the process of monopolizing often involved having state control over a commodity and not allowing privateers to get involved.
Thank you very much. Friends, audience, we've run out of time.
Oh, okay.